The bride was bought as a joke by drunken cowboys. The youngest sobered up and married her properly. The paper was still folded in thirds when Walt Cutter pressed it into my hand. It smelled like bourbon and horse sweat, and something else I couldn't name right off, and Walt was grinning the way he grinned when he'd done something he thought was enormously clever and was waiting for you to agree. "Boy," he said. They all called me boy, every one of them, even Denny Marsh, who was only 4 years older than me. "Boy, you are going to want to read that." I was 22 years old. I had been riding with the Cutter outfit for going on 3 years, which means I'd been Walt's kid brother Clem's shadow for 3 years, and Walt's errand man, and the one who got the short end of every sleeping arrangement and the worst of the night watches and the coffee that had been sitting since morning. I didn't mind it much. I was young and I was learning things, and the work was real work. Cattle drives up from the Texas brushland into Kansas, then sometimes east toward the Missouri railheads. Long, slow miles of dust and river crossings and nights that went cold fast once the sun dropped. I'd been broke when I signed on, and I was still broke, but I wasn't starving, and I'd gotten good enough with a rope that Walt had stopped looking at me like I was temporary. I unfolded the paper. It was a letter from the Pacific Mail Correspondence Bureau out of St. Louis, addressed to someone named Mr. Harold Cutter, which was Walt's given name, which nobody used, which Walt had apparently used when he was drunk and feeling theatrical. The letter said that Miss Nora Voss of Hanover, by way of Cincinnati, was pleased to accept the offer of correspondence with a view toward matrimony, and that she would be traveling westward by rail and stage to Caldwell, Kansas, arriving no later than the 14th of October, and that she hoped to find Mr. Harold Cutter a man of his word and of good standing. The 14th of October was 11 days away. Walt was still grinning. Behind him, Clem and Denny and the 2 Hooper brothers, Lyle and Frank, were watching me read and trying not to fall off the fence they were sitting on from laughing. "You wrote to a mail-order bureau," I said. "We did," Walt said. "Collective venture, cost us $1.50 to register, and Clem here wrote the letter, which I thought was pretty good." "You told her your name was Harold." "Well, it is Harold, just nobody calls me that." I looked at the letter again. Miss Nora Voss. It was good handwriting, straight and even, letters that didn't lean. I'd learned to read from my mother, and I noticed handwriting the way some men notice horses. "What are you going to do?" I said. "Nothing," Walt said. "That's the beauty of it. She shows up, there's no Harold Cutter, she goes back where she came from. Or," he held up one finger, "or she finds out the Harold Cutter that exists is a trail boss who smells like a stockyard and sleeps in a bedroll, and she decides that's not for her, which amounts to the same thing." "That's a woman's whole passage west," I said. "That's a woman's savings." "Boy," Walt said, and the grin didn't move, "you worry too much about people you never met." I handed the letter back, and I went and checked on the horses, and I didn't say anything else about it that night, and the thing is, I should have. That's the part I've turned over probably 10,000 times in the years since. I should have said more. I was young, and I didn't want to make enemies of the men I rode with, and I told myself it would sort itself out, that the woman would arrive and see how things stood and simply leave, and that be the end of it. But it kept sitting in me wrong, like a stone in a boot, small thing, but it doesn't let up. We came into Caldwell 8 days before she was due. Walt had business at the stockyards. We'd sold off the last of a drive that had ended poorly, 3 head lost in a river crossing and 1 man with a broken arm from a spooked horse, and the final accounting needed doing. The Hoopers had family somewhere east of town and rode off to see them. Clem and Denny found a card game within an hour of tying up. I found a rooming house that charged 40 cents a night, and I slept for about 12 hours, and then I went out and walked the town. Caldwell was not a bad town. It had been rough a few years prior, the way all the cattle towns got rough when the drives were coming through heavy, but things had settled some. There was a church, too, actually, and a school, and a dry goods store that had glass in the windows and not just boards. The saloons were still busy, but they weren't the only thing going. A man could get a haircut, a decent meal, his boots resoled. It felt like a place in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. I went to the bathhouse and then to a barber. I bought a new collar. I did these things without knowing exactly why. There wasn't anyone I needed to look decent for, no particular event. But something in me had gotten restless about how I was presenting myself in the world, and I suppose the letter had stirred that up. I asked the barber, casual, if he knew the stage schedule from Wichita. He told me the stage came through Tuesdays and Fridays. The 14th was a Friday. I didn't tell Walt what I was thinking. I don't think I'd fully formed it yet. What I was thinking was still mostly just, someone ought to be there. Someone ought to at least be there, and if the woman showed up expecting a Harold Cutter and there was no Harold Cutter, at least there should be a man standing there who could explain it to her straight and help her figure out her next step. That was what I told myself. The week went slow. Walt got into a dispute at the stockyards over weight, and it ate up most of his attention. Clem and Denny lost money at cards and borrowed some of mine, and I let them because arguing about it wasn't worth the day it would cost. The Hoopers came back looking fed up. The family visit had apparently not gone well, and Frank Hooper was in a black mood for 2 days straight. Nights I sat outside the rooming house on a wooden chair and looked at the street and thought about things I mostly didn't let myself think about. What I was doing with my life. Whether riding for wages was the whole of it. I was 22, but some nights I felt older, and other nights I felt so young it embarrassed me. My father had had his own spread by my age, 40 acres of hard Kansas ground, and it had beaten him and my mother both, but at least it had been his. I had a good horse, a bedroll, and $19 to my name. I thought about the letter some. Not about the woman exactly, I'd never met her, I had no picture of her, just about the act of it. Writing to a bureau in St. Louis, saying you wanted a life with someone. There was something I didn't know how to name in that, something that felt like courage to me even if it also felt desperate. Walt came back from the stockyards on the Thursday in a decent mood because the dispute had gone his way. And that night they all went out and got thoroughly drunk, and I went along as far as the first saloon and had one drink, and then walked back to the rooming house and went to bed. Friday morning I was up at 5. The stage came in at 11:30. I was at the depot early. I don't know what I expected. I'd built something in my head that I hadn't examined closely, some picture that probably had more to do with what I hoped than what was likely. A woman taking a risk like that, traveling west on a letter's worth of faith, could be anyone. Could be someone desperate and not particular. Could be someone who'd been talked into it by circumstances. I told myself to have no expectations, and naturally I had them anyway. 3 people came off that stage. An old man with a trunk, a drummer with his sample case, and a woman. She was not what I'd built in my head. She was not soft or frightened or confused looking or any of the things I'd half imagined. She was medium height with dark hair pinned up neat under a gray traveling hat, and she was maybe 25, maybe a year or two past, and she came down off that stage step with her bag in her hand, and she stood in the street and looked around with an expression that was entirely calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't paying attention, the calm of someone who was paying a great deal of attention and didn't feel the need to show it. She had a satchel that was good leather, worn soft. She had boots that had seen miles. She was not dressed for show. She was dressed like someone who had thought carefully about what she would need. The depot agent came out and she spoke to him. I couldn't hear it from where I stood. He pointed. I figured toward the hotel, and she nodded once, the kind of nod that means she already knew but she was being polite about it, and she picked up her satchel and started walking. I followed at a distance that I told myself was respectful and probably looked peculiar. She went to the hotel and checked in. I went across the street to the general store and stood in the doorway pretending to look at a display of harness fittings for about 15 minutes. Then I went back to the rooming house and sat on my chair and tried to figure out what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan that went past being there. Walt and the others didn't know she'd arrived. They were at the stockyards that morning, all of them, working through the last of the paperwork on the cattle sale, and they'd all been too drunk the night before to be up early enough to bother coming to the depot even if they'd thought of it, which I didn't think they had. I ate lunch at the boarding house table and didn't taste any of it. Then I walked back to the hotel. I don't know what I planned to say. I went to the desk and asked the clerk, a thin young man who seemed bored by everything, whether the woman who had arrived on the morning stage was in, and he said that Miss Voss had gone to the dining room. The hotel had a dining room off to the left. I went to the door and looked in. She was sitting alone at a table by the window with a cup of coffee, and she was reading something, a folded paper, a letter or maybe a document of some kind. And she was frowning at it, the way a person frowns at something they've read before and are reading again because they're trying to decide something about it. I stood in the doorway like an idiot. She looked up, not the way people look up startled, the way people look up who already knew someone was there. "Are you here to eat?" she said, "or are you here about something else?" It wasn't really a question. Her voice was clear and a little low, and the accent had Ohio in it, not the broad, flat Kansas of the people I'd mostly been around. "Something else," I said. "Sit down, then." I sat down across the table from her. The waiter appeared, and I ordered coffee without thinking about it, and then just looked at her for a moment, trying to find the beginning of what I'd come to say. "You're not Harold Cutter," she said. "No. Is he here?" "Not right now. The men I ride with are in town. He's one of them." She set the paper down. I could see now it was the letter from the correspondence bureau, the matching letter to the one Walt had shown me, the one with the details of her travel. She'd brought it. Of course she'd brought it. "What's your name?" she said. Eli Broward." "And what are you here for, Eli Broward?" I'd thought about this. I'd thought about it for 11 days, and I still didn't have a way to say it that didn't make me feel like I was delivering news to someone who'd been counted on to not handle it well. And I hated that feeling because I thought she would handle it just fine. "The letter," I said. "The correspondence registration. Walt Harold Cutter, he did it as a kind of joke. Him and the other men, they were drunk and they thought it'd be funny. They don't intend, there's no one here to meet you the way you're expecting to be met. I'm sorry, that's the truth of it." She was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window. A wagon went by on the street, and she watched it go past, and then she looked back at me. "How long have you known this?" she said. 11 days. "And you came anyway." "I thought someone ought to be here. I thought you deserved at least someone explaining it to your face instead of you just standing at the depot wondering." "That's decent of you," she said. Her voice hadn't changed. She didn't sound shattered or furious. She sounded like a woman taking stock. "I waited. I have enough money for 2 weeks at this hotel," she said. "If I'm careful, I have my return rail ticket. I have some skills, I can cook, I can keep books, I've done both for wages before." She looked at the letter. "I'd like to speak to this Harold Cutter." "All right," I said, "I'll take you to him." What I'd imagined was something direct and uncomfortable, walking Nora Voss up to Walt Cutter and watching Walt have to stand in it, have to look at what he'd done in the real, and with a real person looking back at him. I'd thought he'd bluster and make excuses, and maybe part of me had wanted to watch him do that. To see him be what he was with no audience to play to. What happened was different. We found them at the stockyards office, all 4 of them, Walt and Clem and Denny and Frank Hooper, Lyle having gone off somewhere. They were standing around outside smoking, and they saw me coming up the street, and Walt started to say something laughing, and then he saw who was walking beside me, and his face did something complicated. He got quiet. Clem got quiet too. Denny looked at his boots. Walt took off his hat. It was an instinct, and I don't think he meant to do it consciously, but he did it, and in the doing of it he looked, for 1 second, like he felt genuinely bad. "Miss Voss," I said, "this is Walt Cutter and the others." She stood in front of them and looked at each of them in turn. Just looked, no particular expression, the way you'd look at a fence line to see if it was straight. "Which one wrote the letter?" she said. "Clem wrote it," Walt said, "but it was my idea and my name on it. I'm responsible for it." "All right," she said. She paused. "Was there a purpose to it, or was it just something to do?" Walt was quiet. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I'm not looking for one. I'm looking to understand the situation clearly so I can make my own decisions going forward. I've done nothing wrong. I've traveled a long way, and I've spent money I'd planned on spending differently, and I'd like to know what I'm dealing with." There was a silence that went on long enough to be its own thing, its own weight. "It was just something to do," Walt said finally. And for the first time in the 3 years I'd known him, he sounded his age, which was 43, which was old enough to know better. She nodded once. That same kind of nod, receiving information, not awarding a point. "I won't trouble you further," she said and looked at me. "Thank you for explaining it, Mr. Broward." She walked back down the street toward the hotel, and we all watched her go. Walt put his hat back on. He didn't say anything for a while. "Well," Denny said finally. "Shut your mouth," Walt told him. I went back to the hotel that evening. I don't know how to explain this exactly without it sounding like something it wasn't quite. I wasn't in love with her. I'd known her for 3 hours. What I felt was more like she was something I recognized, and I didn't know what I recognized because I'd never encountered it quite that way before, but it was real and it was clear and it said, "This matters." She was in the dining room again, same table, same coffee. She was writing now instead of reading in a small notebook with a dark cover. She looked up when I came in, and this time the look was different. Not wary, a little considering. "Sit down," she said again. I sat down. "Why are you back?" she said. "I don't know exactly," I said. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," she said. "I'm always fine. That's not a boast, it's just true." "I believe it." She looked at me. "How old are you?" 22. "I'm 26, she said. "I mention it because it seems relevant." "It doesn't matter to me." "I know it doesn't, but I've found it's better to just say things." She folded her hands on the table. "Why did you write to a correspondence bureau if a joke is all you wanted?" "I didn't write to it, Walt did." "I know that. I'm asking why a man writes to a place like that." I thought about it. "I think he was lonely," I said. "I think they all were. I think it was a real feeling that became a game because a game was easier than the real thing." She was quiet, looking at me. "That's a generous reading," she said. "Maybe, but I've ridden with them 3 years. Walt's never mentioned a woman in 3 years, not once." She looked out the window again. The street was getting dark, the lamps being lit one by one down the block. "Why are you still riding with them?" she said. "If you could see what they were doing and why." Nobody had ever asked me that, not directly. I'd had the thought myself, plenty of times, but hearing it from someone else's mouth made it land different. "I don't have anything else yet," I said. "What do you want?" I looked at the lamp on the table between us. It was burning low and even, and the glass was clean. "Land," I said. "My own land, something to show for the years." "How much have you saved?" $19. She didn't flinch at that. She didn't make a face. "What kind of land?" she said. "Good grass, water. I've been watching the country we ride through for 3 years. There's land in the Cherokee Strip, not opened yet, but it'll open. I've got my eye on a piece west of Enid. Maybe 300 acres if a man could get there in time when it opens up." "When will that be?" 3, 4 years, maybe." She nodded slowly. She looked at me with that straight, considering look. "I came out here," she said, "because I had a plan, not because I wanted adventure or because I was desperate. My father died 2 years ago, and I've been keeping books for a feed merchant in Cincinnati ever since and saving everything I could, and I decided that if I was going to make something of myself, it would be here, not there. I thought a husband was the fastest way to land and a real start. I may have been wrong about how to get there, but I wasn't wrong about wanting to get there." "No," I said. "You weren't wrong about that." She looked at me for a moment. "You're different from them," she said. "I ride with them." "People ride with whoever they can find," she said. "That doesn't make you them." I should say here that I was not a man who talked easily. I never had been. My father was a quiet man, and I took after him in that and in other things. The patience, the need to see a thing whole before I committed to it, the preference for doing over saying. I was not easy company, mostly. The men I rode with had learned to work around it. They'd leave me alone when I went quiet, and I'd leave them alone when they were loud, and we had an arrangement. I talked to Nora Voss like I'd been saving it up. Not everything at once. She wasn't the type to want everything at once, I could tell that. But we talked that evening for 2 hours, and then the next morning I came back, and we talked again over breakfast, and it wasn't the talking of strangers feeling their way careful. It was the talking of two people who had both spent too long not saying what they actually thought, and found the relief of it almost embarrassing. She'd kept books for the feed merchant. Before that, she'd taught school for 2 years, and before that she'd nursed her father through a long illness, and she'd done all of it with the same matter-of-factness she brought to everything. And she had opinions about things, real opinions, held for real reasons, and she didn't soften them to be agreeable. She told me what she thought of men who played games with women's lives. She was more specific than I would have been. She told me what she thought of the Cherokee Strip and what she knew about it, which turned out to be more than I expected. She'd read about it, she'd thought about it. She had questions that showed she understood the land lottery system better than I did, and I'd been thinking about it for 2 years. She asked about my horse, not politely, with actual interest. What I'd paid for him, how he moved, what he was good for. She'd grown up with horses in Ohio, she said. She knew a horse from the outside of one. She told me that she was not going back to Cincinnati. Not with anger, just as a fact. She'd made her mind up and she was telling me. "Where will you go?" I said. "I'll find work here for a start," she said. "I can keep books. I can cook for a boarding house or a ranch kitchen. I'll save money and I'll wait for the strip to open and I'll find a way." She paused. "I was planning to find a way with a husband. I may find it alone." I looked at the coffee in my cup. It had gone cold. The morning light was coming in at an angle through the dining room windows, and it caught the dust in the air and her hair and the worn edge of her notebook on the table. I said, "I've got $19. "You mentioned that. And a good horse, and I know that piece of land. I could find it again." She was very still. "And I'm 22, I said, "which is young and I know it, but I'm not those men. I don't want what they want. I want the land and the grass and the water and—" I stopped. My throat did something that surprised me. She waited. "I'd like to find it with someone," I said, "if she was willing." "That's a careful way to put it," she said. "I'm trying to say it right." She looked at me for a long time. Not to make me wait. I didn't feel like she was making me wait. It felt more like she was doing what she did with everything, which was look at it whole before she decided. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough to want to. We've spoken twice." "3 times," I said. "Twice yesterday and once today." Something moved in her face. Not a smile yet, more the beginning of one held back. "I need a week," she said. "I need to be here and look at this town and think clearly. I'm not going to make a fast decision because I'm in a difficult situation. If that's too long." "It's not too long," I said. She nodded once. "All right then." I went back to the rooming house and I sat on my chair outside and I thought about what I'd just done, and the honest truth of what I felt was not panic. It should maybe have been panic. I had $19 and a horse and an idea about some land 3 years away. But what I felt was settled, quiet in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Walt found me there at midday. He sat down on the step below me and rolled a cigarette and smoked half of it before he said anything. "Heard you've been going back to the hotel," he said. "That's right. You sweet on that woman." "I'm talking to her," I said. "Whether there's anything more to it isn't settled yet." Walt smoked. "She's a capable-looking woman," he said. "She is. Probably won't stand for any nonsense." "I'd say that's accurate." He looked out at the street. "I felt bad about it," he said. "The letter thing, in case you wondered." I wondered. "I don't usually." He stopped. Tried again. "When you're my age, boy, you do some things sideways because the straight road seems too far." "Walt," I said, "I've got 4 years before that strip opens. If you want to do a thing straight, you've got time." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he flicked the end of the cigarette into the street and stood up. "You're a peculiar 22-year-old, he said. "I know it," I said. He went back to whatever he was doing, and I sat there in the afternoon light, and somewhere across town Nora Voss was thinking, and I was letting her think. The week she'd asked for was 7 days. I didn't push. I saw her 3 times in that week. Not every day, not arranged and formal, just the natural way a small town works. Crossing paths at the general store, at the depot, once in the street in the early evening when she was walking and I was walking the same direction, and we just walked together for a while without planning to. We didn't talk about the question that was sitting between us. We talked about other things. She told me about her father's farm in Ohio before he'd lost it. It had been good land, she said, bottomland along a creek, rich and dark, and her father had loved it the way you love something that also breaks you. I told her about my mother, who had moved back east when my father died, and who wrote me letters I was never quite good enough at answering. She told me she could read Spanish a little. She'd taught herself from a primer. She thought it might be useful. I told her about the morning I'd ridden ahead of the herd on a drive 2 summers back, up over a rise, and seen the Cimarron Valley stretched below me in the early light, with the river catching the sun and the grass going on, and how I'd sat on my horse for a long time not moving because I didn't want to look away. She got quiet when I told that. Then she said, "That's where you want to go. South of there, the strip country." "I'd like to see it," she said. And that was all she said, and we walked the rest of the way without saying more. On the 7th day, she came to the rooming house. I was cleaning my tack on the front step, the bridle across my knee, working the leather with a rag. I heard her footsteps on the walk. She walked a certain way, even and direct, and I looked up. She was wearing a different dress from any I'd seen before, a dark blue one, and her hair was down a little, not as formally pinned. She stood a few feet from me, and she looked at the bridle in my hands and the rag and the smell of the saddle soap, and she said, "Good leather." "He's worth keeping it right," I said. She sat down on the step beside me, not asking, just sitting, and she was quiet for a moment. "I found work," she said. "The Caldwell Mercantile needs a bookkeeper. They offered me a wage and a room in the back." "That's good," I said. "It's a start," she said. "And I talked to a man at the land office. They have information on the strip, what they know so far about when it opens." "What did he say?" "He said 3 years, maybe 4, maybe sooner." She looked at the bridle. "He said a married couple could file jointly, a double claim in some circumstances. He wasn't certain of the law, but he thought it was likely." I kept working the leather. "Is that why you're telling me?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you because it's information and information matters. I'm not saying anything because of the land." I looked at her then. "I'm saying something," she said, "because I spent a week looking at this, and I looked at you, and I looked at what I know, which is not enough, but it's more than I've had before some of my decisions, and I think—" She stopped, looked at her hands, then back at me. "I think you're a man worth taking a chance on. I think you'll build something. I think you mean what you say. And I think whatever happens with the land or the work or any of it, I'd rather be next to that than be next to the comfortable thing that doesn't go anywhere." I set the bridle down on the step. "Nora," I said. "Don't make a speech," she said. "I don't need a speech." "I wasn't going to make a speech," I said. "I was going to ask if you'd go to the courthouse with me Monday morning." She looked at me. That look direct all the way in, nothing held back. Her eyes were dark brown and steady. "Yes," she said. I reached out and took her hand, right there on the step in the afternoon in front of whoever happened to be passing. Her hand was smaller than mine and strong and warm, and she let me hold it, and she looked at our hands together and then out at the street. "Monday," she said. "Monday," I said. "Walt found out on Saturday. I don't know how. Caldwell was not a big town, and word moved in it the way water moves in a low place, into every corner. He came to me at the stable where I was with my horse. He stood in the door for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dark, and then he came over and he didn't say anything for a little while, just watched me brush the horse's shoulder. "You're going through with it," he said. "Monday morning." He stood there. He had his hat in his hands, turning it, which I'd never seen him do. "You know this isn't. You've known this woman 2 weeks, Eli." 8 days, I said, "but I've known enough people long enough to know the difference." "The difference between what?" "Between who they are and who they're showing you." He was quiet. "She's not showing me anything," I said. "She's just what she is, straight through." Walt put his hat back on. He reached out and put his hand on the horse's neck, a thing he rarely did. He was a man who used horses but didn't generally feel affection for them, or not that he showed. "She'll be good for you," he said. It cost him something to say it. I could hear the cost in it. "I know," I said. "Better than riding around with us." "Different anyway." He looked at me for a moment, and there was something in his face I'd never quite seen there before, some mix of things I didn't have a name for at 22. Maybe I'd have a name for it now. "You be good to her," he said. "That's the plan." He nodded once and left. The morning of the wedding, I was up before light. I dressed in the best clothes I had, which were not impressive, but they were clean and pressed. I'd paid the laundry woman at the boarding house an extra dime, and she'd done right by me. I walked to the hotel, and I waited outside, and Nora came down at 8:30 in her blue dress with her hair put up, and she was carrying a small bunch of dry flowers, goldenrod and something purple I didn't know the name of that she'd gotten somewhere. She looked at me in my pressed shirt, and she didn't say anything complimentary. She wasn't the type to say things just to be nice. But something in her face settled, the way a thing settles when it's where it's supposed to be. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I said. We walked to the courthouse. The clerk who performed the civil ceremony was a heavy-set man named Grover Atkins, who did it 3 or 4 times a week, and had gotten the words down to something efficient. The whole thing took 12 minutes. There were 2 women from the mercantile who'd come as witnesses, Nora had told them, and they'd shown up, which said something about how she'd carried herself in 8 days in that town. When it was done and the papers were signed, we stood outside the courthouse in the October light. It was a cool, clear morning, one of those fall days that doesn't have any grief in it, just clean air and the smell of leaves somewhere. Nora took her flowers and separated one stem, the purple thing I didn't know, and put it through the buttonhole of my lapel, carefully straightening it. Her face was close to mine for a moment doing that, and she looked up and our eyes were level. "There," she said. I put my hand at the back of her neck, gentle, and she held still. "All right," I said. "All right," she said back. And then she smiled, full and real and without reservation, and I had not seen that yet. Not in 8 days of knowing her. I had seen everything else, the considering look and the quiet and the certainty, but not that, and it hit me like a hand against my chest. Good, hard, true. We did not have a honeymoon. We had 2 weeks' wages from her first pay at the mercantile and my $19, which had been reduced to 14 by then from the rooming house fees, and 1 good meal I'd bought her and a new pair of work gloves. We found a small house to rent on the south end of Caldwell, 2 rooms, a wood stove, a window that had been broken and repaired with oilskin instead of glass, and Nora looked at it carefully, checking the floor for rot, testing the stove flue, looking at the roof from outside, and then she said it would do fine. It would do fine? That was Nora. Everything was assessed and found workable or found lacking, and if it was workable, she got on with it. I rode with Walt's outfit one more time that fall, a short push north, 3 weeks, to make up some of what I'd spent. I'd told Nora I was going before we married. She'd said she understood it, and she did. She wasn't a woman who needed constant company. She needed honesty, and she needed a man who'd come back when he said he would, and I came back when I said I would. The mercantile job suited her. She had the books sorted inside 2 weeks. The previous bookkeeper had been sloppy about entries, and she straightened it all out without making a point of it to the owner, just fixed it. And Mr. Arndt, who owned the mercantile, told me once, in the particular careful way men talk to husbands about their wives, that he'd never had records so clean. I didn't tell Nora he'd said it. She wasn't keeping good books for praise. We saved everything we could. I took work where I found it, not trail driving after that fall, but closer work, ranch hand and fence rider, and once a long month of helping rebuild a barn that had burned, hard labor that paid well. I was good with my hands. I always had been. My father had made sure of that. Nora kept a ledger at home, separate from the mercantile one, our ledger, hers and mine, a narrow dark blue book that she kept in the drawer by the window. Every week she'd enter what we'd earned and what we'd spent and what the balance was, and she'd show it to me and we'd look at it together. Not to make me feel judged about the lean weeks, just so we both saw the same thing, so we were in it together. The balance grew slowly, some weeks not at all. One winter it went backward when I was sick for 6 days with a fever and couldn't work, and the doctor cost more than I'd expected. She nursed me through that herself, cool rags, broth she made from a chicken she'd bought at the market, sitting in the chair by the bed in the lamplight and reading aloud to me from a novel she'd had since Ohio. That was the first time I said it. The word I mean. I'd been meaning to say it before. I'm not a man who says things easily, but I knew what I felt, and I'd been carrying it looking for the right time. And the right time turned out to be when I was half delirious with fever, and she was reading to me, and I opened my eyes and saw her in that chair and just said it. She put the book down, she looked at me. She came to the bed and she took my face in both her hands the way you hold something you don't want to drop, and she said, "I know, I've known for a while, I love you too." Then she went back to the chair and picked up the book and kept reading. I lay there listening to her voice and the stove ticking and the wind outside, and I thought, this is the thing, this right here. This is what I didn't know I was trying to get to. Clem Cutter came to see us in the spring. Just Clem, not Walt. He'd split off from Walt's outfit over the winter, some argument about money, which was always the argument with those men, and he was riding east looking for different work, and he came through Caldwell and found us through the mercantile. He sat in our kitchen and drank coffee and looked around at everything with an expression I couldn't entirely read. He was 28, Clem, and he'd always seemed older because he was Walt's brother and Walt's outfit, but sitting in our kitchen he looked his age and maybe a little younger. He looked at Nora's setting cups on the table, and he looked at me and he said, "You did all right, Eli." "I know it," I said. "Walt says to say hello. He looked at his coffee. "I think Walt wishes things had gone different. For him, I mean, not for you." Nora sat down across from him. "Tell him to write to the Bureau again," she said, "but this time mean it." Clem looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a real laugh, something that surprised him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The strip opened in April of 1889. We'd known it was coming for months. The rumors had been building for a year, and then the announcement made it real, and Nora started going through the ledger every week instead of every 2 weeks, and I started looking at maps. We had enough. Not rich, I want to say that clearly, not rich at all, but enough for the filing fee and a wagon and supplies for 3 months and seed for a kitchen garden and some tools. Just enough, and it had taken 4 years of the two of us pointing everything at that number. 4 years of the mercantile ledger and the lean winters and the fence riding and the sick week and the 2 rooms with the oilskin window that we'd eventually replaced with real glass in our 2nd year. The morning of the run, I was up at 3. It was still dark when I hitched the team. Nora came out of the house at 4 with 2 cups of coffee and a wrapped piece of bread and stood beside me while the horses stood blowing steam in the cold air, and she looked up at the sky where the stars were still out. "Everything's in the wagon," she said. "I know, I checked it twice." "I checked it once after you checked it twice." "I know that too," I said. She handed me a cup, and we stood there in the dark and the cold drinking coffee beside a loaded wagon, and I looked at her face in the dark, the set of her jaw, the way she was looking at the stars, and I thought about the depot. About her stepping down from that stage with her satchel, and looking around with that calm look that wasn't carelessness but its opposite. "Hey," I said. She looked at me. "You made the right call," I said, "staying." She looked at me for a long time. Then she took the empty cup from my hand, both cups in one hand, and with her other hand she reached up and put her palm flat against my chest. Just rested it there. "I know it," she said. "I won't tell you everything about that day. The run is its own story, and I've told it before, and a man can only say so much about chaos before the words start to fail it. There were riders going every direction, dust like a wall, men cutting each other off and shouting, and more than one claim dispute before noon. I drove hard and Nora sat beside me on the bench, and she didn't flinch at any of it. We got our piece. 320 acres, which was a double claim, married couple. The land office man in Enid who registered us looked at our papers and looked at us and wrote it down without a word. Good man. The land was south of the line, near a creek that ran most of the year, I'd been told. The grass was tall, and the soil, when I dug my hand into it, was dark and rich, the kind that breaks up in your fingers and smells like something living. There was a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that would give some shade in the summers. We stopped the wagon on a rise above it and sat there for a moment looking down. "That's ours," Nora said. "That's ours," I said. She climbed down from the wagon. She didn't wait for me to help her. She never did. And she walked a few steps down the slope and stood in the grass with her hands at her sides and the April wind moving everything around her, and she was still for a long time. I watched her from the wagon. I have thought a lot about what I was at that moment. Not what I had. The land was real, but it wasn't built yet. It wasn't anything but promise and work and years. What I was. And what I was a man standing on the right ground at last, with the woman who'd chosen him and whom he'd chosen back, and the work ahead that was the kind of work that means something. She turned around and looked up at me on the wagon. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me that morning outside the courthouse, straight through, nothing held back. And it was the same look it had always been, the look that said she saw me, the whole of it, the 22-year-old with $19 and the man he'd grown into, and the man he intended to be, and she had made her assessment and she was here. I climbed down from the wagon. We walked the land together that afternoon, every acre, or what we could cover before the light failed, and I told her what I saw in it, and she asked questions and offered thoughts, and by the time we made camp by the creek we had the first rough shape of what we were going to build. Not rich, I won't say that, not ever, but ours, every inch of it. This was a long time ago. Long enough that Caldwell is a different place now, and the men I rode with are scattered. Most of them. Walt died in 1897. A natural death in a town in Colorado, and Clem had written to tell me, and I'd written back, and we'd kept up the correspondence, which surprised us both. The house we built on that creek land is larger now than the first one. It's been added to twice, once when the children came, and once when Nora decided the kitchen was too small, which it was. The cottonwoods along the creek are bigger. The grass in the pasture is the grass I've been improving for 30 years, good grass, the kind my father's land never quite managed. She runs the books still. Our books, not a mercantile's, the ranch accounts, the expenditures, the taxes, all of it in a series of ledgers that go back to the first dark blue one from Caldwell, which she kept. I asked her once why she kept it. "Because it's where we started," she said, "and I like to know where I started." Some evenings, not every evening, just the right ones, we sit out on the porch after supper when the light is doing what it does at that hour, going golden and long across the pasture, and Nora reads or mends something and I look out at the land. Our land. She still has the habit of reaching out and putting her hand on my chest sometimes. Not often, just when something is said or something happens that she wants to mark without words. I've come to understand it's the most she shows. It's enough. 30-odd years from a freight depot, and a letter written as a joke by drunk men. I think about Walt sometimes. I think about him taking his hat off when he saw her, that reflex, that 1 second of being what he might have been. I hope Clem told him what she said, about writing to the bureau again, but meaning it this time. The joke they wrote got me the life I have. That's a strange thing to sit with, and I've sat with it a long time. I don't forgive them for her sake. She doesn't need that. She never needed anything from them. I've just looked at the whole of it and found I can't regret how it went, because how it went brought her to that depot in October, and she came down off that stage and looked around with that look, and I was there. I was the one who was there. A man's life can turn on a lot of things. Cattle prices, bad weather, which piece of land he gets to first. It can also turn on whether he decides to be there when being there matters, when it's inconvenient and there's no one pushing him and it's the right thing, and just the right thing with nothing else in it. I decided to be there. She decided to stay. Everything else came from that. The light on the pasture now, her in the chair beside me, the cottonwoods down at the creek making their sound in the evening wind. That's the whole of it, that's every word of it.